6th of April, 1984. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project, a project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Today I'm interviewing Mr. Bob Talbot, who's had experience in social work in 4 provinces across Canada. Bob, in order to get started this morning, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born and a little bit about your background.
I was born at a little town in Saskatchewan, Wilcox, Saskatchewan, which is now known as the Notre Dame College, and in 1912. And I attended school in Wilcox, got all my public school and high school in Wilcox, Saskatchewan. Then I attended the Regina Normal School and became a teacher and taught for some 10 years in the province of Saskatchewan.
Were you teaching during the Depression?
I was teaching during the Depression, yes.
What was that like? I've heard that it was pretty rough.
It certainly was grim, but it was really an exciting experience because as teachers we had no supplies. We had to make up all our supplies. We got books sent in the carload lots of the relief that came in the cars from Ontario, and they used to put boxes of school books in, and that's how we got our school books for the texts for teaching. This was in 1932. 1931 and 32. In the best part of it was the relationship that existed between the students and the teachers during the Depression. It was really wonderful. They were excited about going to school, and I taught in a Romanian district where a lot of the children starting school couldn't speak English, and this was an exciting experiment too, trying to teach them to speak English. A lot of them didn't speak English at home. Then I joined the services, left the teaching profession, and after the war I came back and right out to BC. I went to university and finished my arts degree, and then entered the School of Social Work.
Did your war experience have any effect on the later practice of social work that you were involved in?
Yes, it did. I think my war experience really encouraged me to go into social work.
In what way, Bob?
Well, I was stationed in London, and I was trained as disciplinarian, but I had charge of all the troops in the London area, and one of my biggest headaches was okaying a telegram each morning back to Ottawa that there were no casualties among the Canadian Air Force. So if anyone was missing on parade, I had to take a driver and go out and find out what had happened. So I was quite relieved if everyone attended the parade. And with this sort of a responsibility, I became interested in people and what they were doing. I had to interview all these people and find out what they were doing and how they were living and approve the places that they were lodging, because no one lived in barracks of the Canadians during the war in London. Because of the heavy bombing, I thought they should be dispersed, so everyone was allowed to find their own billets. But they had to be approved by someone at headquarters, and I was that person that had to approve them.
When you were in the military, did you have any contact with the social workers who were in the military?
Yes, I did. There were quite a lot at headquarters where I was stationed. There were social workers who worked for the YMCA, and social workers who came in from the British system and talked to Canadians, and I was invited several times to go and look at some of their projects that was happening. And one of the most interesting, of course, was the sending of the British children back to Canada.
What happened there?
Yeah, this was where the social workers had to go and interview the parents and convince them that it would be to their advantage to let the children go to Canada, away from the heavy bombing. And I wasn't directly involved with it, but I saw what was going on because I was a Canadian and they were going to Canada. And recommended several spots where they, probably would be accepted.
You did?
Yes, yeah.
Were your recommendations as far as individual families here?
No, just sort of communities. Communities where it had been, and a great many of them came to BC and to Saskatchewan. I wasn't familiar with the eastern communities at that time.
So, and you said that after the war you came directly to British Columbia?
Yes, I was married just before I went overseas, and after 4.5 years I came back and I picked up my wife in Regina, and we came right out to British Columbia. And I was still in the services, and the headquarters in London had lost my documents, so I couldn't get discharged right away, which was rather nice because I was entered into university but couldn't start until I got my discharge. And they wouldn't discharge me until my documents arrived. And finally, after 3.5 months, my documents arrived. And I started the university to complete my arts degree in, I want to get the date right here, so far back I can hardly think of it, in, see, 1945. 1945.
And when did you enter the School of Social Work?
I entered the School of Social Work in 46. I had some university work before, and this was accepted. So I only had to do a 1.5 years. And I completed my arts in a 1.5 years because there were spring sessions, winter sessions, and summer sessions. And then I entered the regular session and completed my degree. So it was in 1947 that I entered the School of Social Work.
What induced you to enter the School of Social Work rather than continue on with teaching or something else?
It was the end of the Depression, and social work then was a fairly new profession, and it was being talked about, and I had read about it overseas and had talked to some of the people overseas who were involved and decided that's what I'd like to try. And of course it meant contact with people, which I really enjoy.
Yeah, yeah. What kinds of courses did you have at the School of Social Work?
In the last year of my arts degree, there was a class which everyone entering the school had to take. It was called the Introduction to Social Work. And it counted as a credit on your arts and also as a credit on your social work degree. And then I took counseling, the group work, administration, social work and the law, social work, and what was the other? This is terrible, I can't think of the word. Interviewing techniques. Yeah. And Marjorie Smith was the head of the school at that time, and was all during the time that Bill Dixon, who just recently died in December of last year, was the professor of administration, and I had a lot of contact with him because I was interested in the administration.
Did you do field placements while you were there?
Yes. I did field placement at the Children's Aid Society, the Public Welfare Department in Vancouver, and at the mental hospital at Essendale.
So you had three placements.
Yes. Yeah.
How did those help you later on? Was there relevance?
Yes, I think, of course, I became interested in public welfare through Professor Dixon, and my placement, Jimmy Sadler was the director of the regional administration in Vancouver at the time, and I was a student there, and he influenced me, I think, in going into public welfare.
Bob, I wonder if I can try and clarify something. I understand that Vancouver had its own welfare department.
Yes.
But Mr. Sadler worked for the provincial government.
That's right.
Who was your placement with?
My placement was with the provincial government. Yeah. But there were two, like Mr. Sadler's position, and I had his position after he became Director of Welfare for BC. What you were the regional administrator of several municipalities, and each municipality had their own social work section.
I see.
So you were the overall negotiator for the provincial government with the municipalities. And of course the city of Vancouver had a big social work department at that time, as also did the municipality of Burnaby. And the administrator, of course, visited all the offices and made certain that the provisions of the legislation were being carried out by the municipalities.
At that time, 1947, 48, what was the relationship between social assistance money and social services?
It was very good. The social assistance really, though, was administered by the municipalities, directly by the municipalities. It was administered by the province in the unorganized areas, areas such as Bowen Island, Sechelt, Powell River, places where there weren't municipalities at that time. And the Assistance Act then was administered directly by the public welfare workers of the province.
Mm-hmm. And if a client came in to get social assistance, was casework a necessary component of receiving social assistance?
Yes, it was at that time, very much so, because most of the municipalities had hired caseworkers. And caseworkers, if other problems were detected, the social assistance worker would refer them to a specialist family specialist or a child welfare specialist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But most of the public welfare workers carried what we call generic caseloads. And they had, an example, I had a caseload at Powell River in which I had public assistance, old age assistance, family counseling, child welfare, protection, the whole gimmick.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was the only social worker there.
So when you finished at School of Social Work, you went to work for the department?
Provincial government, and worked out of the Vancouver office where I was a student, but commuted every week to Powell River.
What kind of distance is that? I'm not familiar with.
It's about 80 miles, but at that time the only way to get there was no road at the time, and no ferries like there are now, and you had to go by the old Princess Mary or the Union steamship boats up the coast. You had to go by boat.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about, I guess, a 6-hour trip.
So how would a typical week go for you then? Those
Well,
days?
I would leave Sunday evening on the midnight boat, Princess Mary, and arrive at 6 a.m. They let you stay on the boat until 8 o'clock, and then check in at the hotel, which became really my office, pick up the government car, and work there until Thursday morning.
Mm-hmm.
And Thursday morning I would take the boat back to Vancouver, and Friday I had to do all my dictating and working on the files and everything, get ready for the next week.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I didn't go back until the middle of the week if I had a lot of the bookwork to do.
Mm-hmm. Were there unusual kinds of things that were happening with your caseload in Powell River and area?
Yes, there were. I had a lot of protection cases, a great many adoption cases, which were very interesting. Numerous family service cases because of the nature of the work there. Everyone worked in the mill, and it was split shift work, different hours, and there were a lot of family problems. Mm-hmm. And of course a lot of public assistance cases. People mm-hmm. that, not too many public assistance because the wages in the mill were very high and people were employed, local people were employed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's quite interesting to note right now they're advertising for a social worker of their own for the mill, McMillan and Bloedel. There's a big ad in the paper just the other day. And so I think what they're doing, they're going into more counseling for their workers.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And
how long did you stay in that job with the department as the...
Yeah, I was in Powell River for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then I left Powell River to accept a job as supervisor in the Cloverdale, BC office just outside of New Westminster, mm-hmm. and became supervisor there. And I had a very unique position there because I was the municipal administrator, but the provincial government supervisor. I had to do both jobs. And so I looked after the public assistance for the municipality and the casework and the group work and the family counseling for the provincial government.
Did the fact that you were acting in those dual roles cause conflict for you?
Yes, it did.
What happened?
I stuck it out for 6 months and then decided to take another job.
Could you describe the conflict that occurred?
Well, quite often there was, if in the legislation there was conflict between the municipality and the provincial government, and sitting in the middle, I was a provincial government employee, also employed by the municipality, I had to make a decision, and it was very difficult because you had to work with all the municipal other workers, and I was in the municipal office.
Mm-hmm.
That's where my office was. And at the same time, I had to demand my boss, who was Jimmy Sadler in Vancouver, that I was carrying out the intent of the provincial legislation.
Mm-hmm.
So that led to my next move.
Yes, which was?
I moved to Victoria to become the assistant deputy of child welfare, assistant superintendent of child welfare is the correct title. And I worked under Ruby McKay, which was a very, very interesting experience.
What was that like?
Well, Ruby, as you know, is a very dynamic person, and she was a very keen social worker, and she was very concerned about children, and it was really a wonderful experience. She taught me a lot about dealing with children's problems. And I worked with Ruby until I guess, let's see, until I moved to Vancouver. And as her assistant, there were other workers working in the child welfare. There was a child welfare division. There was a protection worker. There was an adoption worker. And there was a worker who handled all the court cases. And she, of course, and then there was an adoption worker beside. I think I mentioned that before, didn't I? And they all reported, some of them reported to Ruby and some of them reported to me. But during that time, the numerous new ideas that came out of the Child Welfare Department were really fantastic. Ruby was concerned with children, and she introduced several new ideas, first across Canada, for protection of children, and also for the new adoption practices. And one of those, I think, was that no child could be placed for adoption until after it had remained 10 days in care. This was to give the mother adequate time to work with the social worker to really make up her mind that she wanted to give up that baby. And of course the worker encouraged her to try and keep the baby at that time if things were ideal and she could handle it. So this 10-day space really was a wonderful thing, and I'm sure it saved a lot of heartbreaks later on.
And in the field of child protection, she was innovative as well, you said.
Yes, in child protection, she was very well respected by the legal profession and by the judges who handled most of the cases, the child welfare cases. And Ruby was able to get across to them some of her concerns about changes that had to be made to protect children. And right at the moment, I can't think of the legislation that came through, but I'll think of it later. But anyway, the protection angle was, BC Protection Act was a very good act, and was really quite well known across Canada.
Yeah. Bob, where were you when there were the difficulties with the Doukhobors and the placement of so many children while their parents were in prison?
I was right in the middle of it.
Oh, could you tell me about that?
As deputy superintendent to Ruby, she was concerned about these children because they all had to be taken into care. So she asked me if I would go up to New Denver and take some social workers with me and take charge of the house or the home where the Doukhobor children were to be placed. So I agreed to. My family were young at the time, and it was really quite an experience for me and also for my children, because they thought in the 3 months that I'd been away that I really had left home.
Yeah.
So I had to attend to that as well. But in New Denver, the children they were really almost forcibly removed. They weren't, you know, there wasn't any other force used except that the workers had to go up and take the babies out of the arms of the mothers and place them in this home. The children were, the older children were no problem whatsoever. In fact, they loved it, and of course they went to school. We had teachers there in the home at New Denver. And the parents were allowed to visit once every week, which was usually a Sunday afternoon. And it was amazing to see the change in the children when the parents came to visit. They went back to the old Doukhobor style of, you know, being against everything. When they were in school during the week, they were ideal students and just crazy and eager to learn. One little boy went from about grade 1 up to about grade 5 in about 2 months. Just able to, they were just eager to learn. They'd had no formal schooling whatsoever.
Were you responsible for or involved in the dispersal of the children when the issue was sort of...
No, I had gone then. Yeah. But the period of that time when the children had to be removed and were living in the Japanese huts that were there, this was the Japanese camp they were in, was really quite interesting, and it was really hard on the social workers because they were being asked to do everything which was foreign to their social work training. You know, like removing children from their mothers and a lot of force feeding of the children and this sort of thing, which really was foreign to the social workers. Mary King was one of the workers that worked with me. She's now in New Zealand. And Berna Holt, who is now Mrs. Jackson. I don't know where she is now. But they were quite concerned about the these children being torn between the two types of background, you know, their own background with their parents, and also what we were trying to do of making them go to school.
Because, well, that had been the issue
That's right.
around which a lot of the difficulties had arisen
Yeah.
anyway. Force feeding the children, I hear a bit of difficulty there with the children you describe as being eager to learn. And,
Well, we allowed the mothers of the youngest children to stay in the center. Then they had decided that the sanitary conditions in the hut wouldn't take the number of people that were there, and they had to be moved. Some of them had to be moved. And in this case, some of the younger children had to be removed from their mothers because they were now in care, and they were wards of the temporary wards of the superintendent. And the force feeding thing was their mothers had said, well, don't eat any of the food that these people put out for you. And a lot of the kids, the Doukhobor children could hang on and do the things that their parents had told them and be very strict when the parents were there. But as soon as the parents disappeared, there was no problem. So the parents were sent home without their children. And they were allowed to take the younger babies with them, but not the school-aged children.
To look at that question or that period of time from a different angle, to your recollection, was the professional association making any comments about what was happening in New Denver?
I can't recall any. I don't think so. I think they knew that that the children had to be taken into care. In other words, the orders from Victoria were these children had to go to school. And of course, the social workers and myself and the teachers that were there had to carry it out.
Okay. You returned from New Denver to, was it Vancouver that you were
No,
there?
to Victoria.
To Victoria.
To Victoria. And finished working here. And then Jimmy Sadler, the deputy minister, had retired. And there was a move all along. And I took Jimmy Sadler's job in Vancouver, and he came to Victoria as director of welfare. And Mr. Lundy became the deputy minister. And I went to Vancouver as the regional administrator for the Vancouver area.
So then you would have been in a position to deal with the conflicts that you had
That's right.
had before.
That's right.
What was it like being a couple steps up the ladder?
Well, I think my wife described it best. She said, you know, you'll never be happy as administrator. You get your greatest satisfaction of dealing with people.
Mm-hmm.
But it was tough to make the switch. You are now in the decision-making process, and you had to change a lot of your thinking, and you had to say, well, this is the legislation, so it has to be carried out.
Mm-hmm. I sense a bit of, perhaps a bit of tension in some of the decisions that you had to make. Was there a conflict between legislation and your principles or social work ethics or some other principle?
No, not too great. There was some conflict which you had to resolve in yourself. But in an administrative job, you really quickly have to learn to leave your problems on your desk when you go home.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they get you down. And I was able to do this after practicing quite a while. At first, it worried me a lot about
Yeah.
you know, and I would worry about having to do this, which was really against what I thought was right. But eventually, it sort of worked itself out.
Mm-hmm. During the period of time that you were in that position, if I remember right, the BC economy took a downturn and there began to be
Yes.
some pretty extensive
Yes.
cuts in social programs.
That's right.
How did that affect you and what you were doing?
Well, it's funny you should mention this, because just the other day I was talking about this period that we had lived through it during that time. We had to sort of reduce staff and ask workers to take on heavier caseloads, and I'm sure it was felt, but it seemed to work out all right. There was a letdown really in the social service program to the extent of holding back the amount of assistance that was granted and the amount of assistance that the provincial government would give to the municipalities
Mm-hmm.
at that time. But it was an interesting period because I think in social work during the years that I started, the first 5 or 6 years, we had a fairly free hand, and we may have become too complacent and not looked after the things properly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite easy to do this when you can convince your legislative people that programs are needed and you get them without too much effort.
Mm-hmm.
And so a tightening up, of course, had to come, and we had to implement it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was an interesting time, and one that I don't regret, because you learn a lot. Social work, I think, throughout the years has gone in cycles of 20 years. 20 years from now, you probably find things have improved a great deal, and what social workers think they're going through now will sort of disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And in times of lack of finances, it seems that the social programs usually get hit the worst. And I don't know any answer to it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the money isn't there, how can you implement the program?
Mm-hmm. I've heard some people talking over the last couple of years about restraint and cutbacks and things like that, and talking about the phenomenon that you've just described. It's so many of us learned how to manage up and get bigger and expand.
That's right.
Learning how to manage down has been proven a real challenge for some people.
That's true.
Did you find that you required different administrative or management skills when you were managing down in the late 50s or mid 50s?
I think you had to teach the social workers and the workers who were in programs management techniques of their programs. In other words, they had to do the things that were urgent and let the other things that weren't urgent sort of wait until a more suitable time. So program management became very important.
Mm-hmm.
and we used to hold seminars on this. You know, how do you make the decision about if an emergency happens, what do you drop to in order to take care of the emergency? And what programs do you, instead of visiting 5 or 6 times during the period that you're supposed to, you cut it down to 2 or 3, and maybe have a longer visit.
Was there a conscious priority setting process within the department at that time? We're going to put kids ahead of seniors, ahead of unwed parents, anything like that?
I don't think so. Actually, the supervisors of the programs, like Ruby and Victoria and the Family Service, Marie Riddell, they were very conscious of the load that the social workers carried. The old age assistance program, of course, was quite heavy at that time. The aging population was coming forward. And the poor little social worker, of course, had all these programs throughout the province, and he had to determine himself, really, what had to be done. Now, there would be an urgent protection case which would come to their attention, and Ruby would say, well, we'll have to do this, and the worker would do it, and let the visit for somebody waiting for a pension probably wait. And this sort of thing, and that was the sort of decision they had to make.
Okay. In what, 1958 or so, you left British Columbia? And
Yeah, in 1958, I left BC and went to Saskatchewan as Director of Welfare. And I replaced Marie Parr as Director. And as Director in Saskatchewan, it was the years when their programs were really running very well. They had a lot of trained social workers in Saskatchewan, and they had a very good educational program in which they gave educational grants, which was quite interesting because many of the BC had a program at that, but it wasn't as extensive as the Saskatchewan program. The Saskatchewan program for training, they would give grants, they would pay the students' tuition and a monthly stipend to live on, and in return the student had to agree to work for 2 years for the province if they got 1 year of training. If they stayed for their master's degree for 2 years of training, then they had to agree to sign an agreement to work for 3 years.
Oh.
And this was an interesting period for me because the Director of Personnel, Ken Torrance, and myself took on the job of visiting all the schools of social work and interviewing the students and determining which ones wanted to come to work in Saskatchewan.
So you were out on a recruitment tour?
That's right. Yeah, and it was an interesting aspect of my job.
What kind of difference did you find from school to school?
Not too much. Of course, I had a weakness for the school at BC because I was a graduate of BC.
Yeah.
And I visited Manitoba and the school in BC and the school at Carleton. You know, in not Carleton, but in Ottawa, it was St. Pat's. St. Pat's. And the school at McGill and Toronto. Visited them all.
During the period of time that you were in Saskatchewan, some pretty significant developments took place. I'm thinking of the new Social Aid Act that came in, and then the Canada Assistance Plan, and then the Saskatchewan Assistance Plan.
Yeah.
How are you involved in those developments?
Well, of course, the Canada Assistance Act was the change in cost sharing from the federal government and the provincial government. The Saskatchewan Assistance Act was implemented, but I had a very good person working, the Director of Public Assistance, Art Savan, who's now passed away, and Dorothy Zarski, who was his assistant, did most of the legwork on that program. And of course, I had to chair sort of the meetings. But the Canada Assistance Program, when it was taken up by the various provinces, was quite a step forward. You know, the sharing for the federal government to come in with this amount of sharing. And of course, all the provinces wanted to take advantage of this sharing process. Where we were involved within the department was in trying to convince our legislators that this was a good thing for them to accept. And
Was there some reluctance?
no, of course, there's never reluctance when money is involved.
As long as it's someone else's?
That's right.
Yeah.
But what we had to do was really to convince the municipalities, and this is why the Saskatchewan Assistance Act was implemented, to convince the municipalities to go along.
The municipalities had a role in social assistance.
That's right, yeah. You see, in the early days, the municipalities administered their own relief.
Yeah.
And then when the government came in with the Social Assistance Act, then the provincial government stepped in and shared with the municipalities the cost of assistance.
Mm-hmm.
And then as the province took over more financial responsibilities, the municipalities had to determine whether they wanted to administer it or they wanted the provincial government to administer it. And Vancouver and a lot of the municipalities around Vancouver wanted to administer their own.
Mm-hmm.
And they hired their own administrator and their own workers.
Mm-hmm. And in Saskatchewan, was the issue the same, that some municipalities chose to administer their own and let the province do some
in
of it?
Saskatchewan, city of Regina, of course, had a social assistance group, and Saskatoon, but then eventually they both asked the provincial government to take over,
Mm-hmm.
and the provincial government set up their own offices within the cities,
Mm-hmm.
and retained their work throughout the rest of the province. So the Saskatchewan government really, the welfare department really became the chief administrator. The city of Moose Jaw held out for a long time and continued to administer their own social assistance.
Mm-hmm. At that time, well, let me say, currently, and I think perhaps eternally, there's been questions about the adequacy of social assistance rates. Was that a question in Saskatchewan during the years that you were there?
Yes, it came up periodically, but the rates at that particular time were not too bad. And they had other means by which they could give special diets or money for special diets if it was recommended by doctors. So someone who was really in need and say needed extra nutrition and things like that, you could get this through this special program, a special assistance program.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that during that time, of course, at one time the social assistance rates were much higher than the pension rates, and people then, of course, had to be supplemented for their old age pensions.
When would that have been, Bob?
Yeah.
About when?
Oh, this was quite early, way back in. Well, it happened here in BC and also in Saskatchewan, where they got extra assistance from either the municipality or the province if it was
Mm-hmm.
needed. You were asking about, was it adequate? Were the rates adequate? I don't think they were ever what you would call really adequate, but they weren't intended to be that way, I think. They were intended to give the people the basic necessities and then encourage them to get out if they could and work on their own through the social assistance. But the program of allowing people to work was where the greatest criticism came in, because if they earned so much, then this was deducted from their social assistance rates.
Mm-hmm.
They're only allowed to earn, and this is still in effect today, I think, in most of the provinces. If their earnings increase, then they are deducted from their social assistance rates.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that I understand that came up during the time you were in Saskatchewan was the idea of work for relief or work for aid.
Yes.
Do you remember the discussion about that and what happened?
Yes, it wasn't too evident during the period that I was there. It was prior to that, but there were one or two instances where people in municipalities around Vancouver were asked to go out and work on the roads
Mm-hmm.
and gathering up rubbish along the highways and this sort of thing. but they were paid to do it.
Mm-hmm.
They were paid. And while they were getting this extra pay, the amount of social assistance would be adjusted.
Mm-hmm. And was that in BC or Saskatchewan?
In Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Another thing that I'm aware of that was, well, I don't know whether it was an issue or not, I guess that's what I wanted to ask, is the relationship between Indians, the bands, and the Department of Social Welfare, or whatever it was called in Saskatchewan at the time. How were you, how did the department relate to Indians and Métis, and what was going on there?
Well, the big problem there was that during the period I was in Saskatchewan, the Indian population, of course, was mostly in the north at that time, or they stayed chiefly on the reserves. Since that time, of course, they have hit the cities, Saskatoon and Regina, and created a great many problems. During my time there, I think the big argument was that the Indians were a federal responsibility, and they weren't a municipal or a provincial responsibility. But if there was protection of children involved, then the province would become involved, and we would go on the reserve, and usually talk to the head of the band and say we'd heard about a problem with children, and usually get their permission to go in and investigate.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm trying to think of any assistance cases with Indians that we had. Of course, the Métis were entitled to full services that we had as a citizen of the province. They got the same service as anybody else. But the Indians had their own health workers, and they had their own, the administration of their own funds through their band funds. And I think thinking back now, I think there was tension really between the Indian population and the white population, the same as it is now.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it was as great because the problems weren't as great as they are now.
Mm-hmm.
In the city of Regina, as everyone knows, of course, the Indian problem has become quite acute, and they're trying to deal with it in a humane way.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Indian population feel that they should now be capable of administering their own affairs, and I think they're proving it in many instances.
Certainly in Manitoba, they're
Yes.
in the area of child welfare. They have
There's no
worked
doubt
out
about
some
it.
kind of
Yeah.
some kind of agreement.
Yeah.
As sort of a concluding question on this section, before we break for some juice or something, I'm wondering if over the years, the first 20 years or so that you were in the profession of social work, did you have much involvement with the professional associations in the various provinces?
Yes, I belong to the association in BC and in Saskatchewan, and saw a great many changes take place in allowing people who weren't fully professionally trained to come in as part-time members in this sort of arrangement. And then just about the time that I was leaving was, of course, when the RSP, the registered social work thing was starting up.
Oh.
And that was quite interesting, but I wasn't involved in that at all.
Mm-hmm. I'm not aware of that. Can you describe it a bit?
I'm not too clear about it either, but it was the time when the profession decided that everyone who had a certain degree should be a registered social worker.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the plan started in Ontario,
Mm-hmm.
and came out of the headquarters of the professional association, and then gradually sifted down to Saskatchewan and the other provinces.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I haven't belonged to the association now for a number of years because I've been out of the social work for since 1977,
Mm-hmm.
and some years before that,
Mm-hmm.
when I went to the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay, well maybe that's a good place to stop and take a break.
yeah, okay.
Bob, when we left off, we were talking about Saskatchewan and your position as director of welfare and your relationship with the professional association. You left Saskatchewan in 1967 as Director of Welfare. Where did you go? And,
I went
and,
in 1967 let's see, it was early March, I guess it was. I went to Winnipeg, and I became the the regional supervisor of rehabilitation for the federal government, Department of Manpower and Immigration.
What inspired you to make that kind of a change?
Well, it was just at that time that there was a change of government coming in Saskatchewan, and a lot of people at my level were being let go for no reason other than political reason, probably. But I can't say that with any assurance. And we had a sort of a directors group that met from all the departments, and following one of our meetings, we decided that it might be time, we've been there long enough, to maybe look around and for other jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw this job in the paper and didn't think much about it. And I got a phone call from a social worker in Regina saying that the assistant director of the Manpower and Immigration Manitoba and the Prairie region was in Regina. Would I care to see her? And I said, yes, sure. I'd go down and talk to her. And the result was she offered me a job.
Mm-hmm. What were you doing as Director of Rehabilitation?
Well, the rehabilitation program, of course, for manpower and immigration was the idea of getting people back to work. And one of my duties for each of the provinces, the Prairie region at that time in manpower and immigration consisted of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories. And the regional office was in Winnipeg, but we had charge of all the manpower offices throughout this Prairie region. And one of the things that I had to do as rehabilitation supervisor of the three Prairie provinces was to mount with other supervisors courses which would lead to rehabilitation of workers who were either on welfare or were needed to be rehabilitated back into the job market.
Mm-hmm.
People would come in to the offices and would be poorly trained and would need training. So the Department of Manpower and Immigration would buy courses from the various colleges and then send some of the people that they interviewed who were not trained to these courses by paying them allowances and whatnot until they graduated, and then they were able to go to work.
Mm-hmm.
So my job was partly to negotiate some of the courses with the college people and to determine through the workers those people that really should be rehabilitated and sent to various courses.
Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to, perhaps you could, rather than me trying to think of the answer to the question, I should ask it of you. The relationship of the training and experience that you'd had in social work to this kind of job, to this particular job.
Yeah, well, I think your casework approach and your dealing with people at various levels and people who were in need and whatnot sort of helped me with this idea of the rehabilitation process. Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the ideas in the welfare program is to try and get people back to work as well. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of a natural inclination, but of course the people that we're dealing with in manpower were really a much younger group than they were in the welfare departments, than the clients in the welfare department. Mm-hmm. The rehabilitation process that the federal government were trying to achieve through their manpower program was very much almost like a welfare program. You know, in setting up a study course or seeing that they got the proper medical care and whatnot if needed. Anything that was needed to rehabilitate that person so they could get back into the job market.
Mm-hmm. What was the job market like in those days in the Prairie provinces?
It was not too bad. There were people who graduated from our training courses quite often were snapped right up. One of the things that we had to be careful of was that we kept the training courses in line with what was needed through the employment picture. In other words, different companies would need certain types of workers, and we found out very quickly that there weren't types of courses available. So you had to convince the colleges to set up courses that would meet the demands that the job market were demanding at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And this was quite interesting because once a college, as you know, gets a course going, they don't like to change them too well. And you know, the old story of the professor using his notes from 1920 up to 1960. But and we had to convince the college people to mount certain courses, and of course they were reluctant to do so unless we could guarantee a certain number of people to come in. And of course the department then, of course, would pay so much to help them mount the course and to pay for the so many people that went in, so much a person.
At that time, there were, I assume, a fair number of women who were entering or re-entering the labor force.
Yes.
And again, in the prairie provinces, probably a fair number of Indian and Métis people who might have made up part of your caseload.
Yes.
Did those groups of people cause any special issues for you to deal with?
No. Of course, there were more men initially, but one of the interesting courses that I should tell you about is the women's heavy-duty machinery course, where in the Northwest Territories they established a course which taught women how to drive these huge tractors and machinery, and became very successful. And we graduated several women from this who became fully employed and became almost in demand because they seemed to be on the job more than the men were. And that was quite an interesting course. And the college up north in Yellowknife and in northern Alberta put on this course for us. And of course they had the equipment and everything, which they borrowed from the big machine companies.
During the course of doing this job, Bob, did you have much to do with the unions?
No, not too much, because that was dealt with by another section of our department. Yeah, but there were problems with the unions on about the numbers of people that we were turning onto the job market, really, because the unions felt that they should really control the numbers who were being employed, I suppose. I think it's always that way anyway.
During the course of the time that you were working for Manpower, could you describe some of the challenges that you faced in that type of work?
Well, I suppose the biggest challenge was to get sufficient funds to mount these courses, and also to convince the college, and we had to deal through the provincial departments because we were dealing with the colleges which came under the provincial government, and convince the provincial governments to provide the staff, you know, to mount the courses. And we had, and of course then there was always the big hassle, well, if the federal government wants it, they should pay more and more and more, which is still true today, I guess, as far as provincial relations are concerned. And you had to be very careful, or I had to be very careful, and so did the other people who were working with us, about not upsetting the balance between the province and the federal government. Because when things were going quite smoothly, there was no hitch at all. But the minute that you raised a cost feature, then it became who's going to pay for it. And usually it had to be determined, and quite often it ended up with the federal government paying for it anyway.
Did you have much to do with the Federal Department of Health and Welfare or their representatives?
Not too much, except I was on one or two committees, you know, the national committees, the Committee on Aging. I was a representative from that. That was because of my welfare background and because of my work in Saskatchewan. But I continued on it for a while when I went to because they asked me to continue on this. And of course, this survey wasn't completed yet, so I just continued anyway and got permission.
Did you say what survey?
The old age assistance survey, you know, the survey on aging, which was headed by Lola Wilson. Do you remember that name?
No.
No. Well, she's still in the Department of Aging in Ottawa Federal Department, looking after the aging problems. And I was on that committee, and of course I stayed on it until the committee wound up. But I had no other. The other contact, of course, would be with the health side of the health and welfare, because of medical coverage for these people when they're in training.
Oh.
Yeah. It was who was going to pay for their coverage, the federal or the provincial or both or whatnot. And of course, we finally got the health and welfare people to cover them during this period. But I had no direct contact with the welfare part at that time.
You worked in several locations while you were with Manpower. Were you doing the same kind of work in each place?
Yes, I left Winnipeg and went, received a promotion and went to Toronto with the Department of Manpower and Immigration, and I became the director of the Special Services.
What's that?
Which was the services, you know, all the services that rehabilitation, training, and health, all the special services that Manpower and Immigration were responsible for. And it was, there was the director of the region, and then there was the assistant director of the region, and then there was the director of the special services, which was my position. And they were the senior positions in the Department of Manpower and Immigration. And after I had been in Toronto for about a year and a half, I guess, nearly 2 years, the structure of the Manpower and Immigration changed. You know, there was a name change came at that time. And at this point, I had decided then that I would sooner be in the Prairie Provinces. And a vacancy came up in Winnipeg. So I asked if I could be transferred back, and I was transferred back because I was getting ready for retirement at that time.
And did you go back to the same kind of job that you'd been doing in Winnipeg before?
Yes, I did, to the rehabilitation side.
During that period of time when you were working in Manpower and Immigration, again, I'm still exploring the relationship of social work and what you had learned before to that kind of work. Did you have much contact with social workers during that period of time?
I had contact in Toronto with social workers. I think I mentioned one of them to you. Harry Willems was in Toronto then. He had worked for me in Saskatchewan, so we kept up our contact there, and I was quite aware of what he was doing with the Ontario department. And in Winnipeg, I had contact with the chap by the name of Joe Sells, who was Assistant Director of Child Welfare for Millie Battle in Saskatchewan at the time that I was director, so I had contact with what he was doing in Manitoba. And I think those are the main contacts that I had with the social workers at that time. At this time, I no longer belong to the professional association.
Right. I'd like to move now to a couple of general questions to sort of move toward a summing up. As you look back over the years of your career, Bob, I wonder if there are accomplishments about which you're particularly pleased, things you're particularly glad that you did, or that you experienced?
Well, I think there are several things, but one of them worth mentioning, I think, is the work I did as a social worker when I first started out in the adoption program. I think it gave me a great deal of satisfaction to see couples who, for medical reasons or other reasons, couldn't have children, convince them to take a family and then to sort of follow up and see what had happened to some of the children. And I have kept contact with 2 or 3 of the families, and I'm very proud of the way some of them have turned out, and of the way that the young couples really have progressed in raising these particular children that were adopted.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really, that gives me a great deal of satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they have taken the initiative in keeping contact with me, of course, makes me feel very good.
Mm-hmm. Other things that you're glad happened to you?
I'm glad I went into social work. I think it was, if I had to do it over again, I'm sure I would do the same thing.
You would, eh?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure I would do the same thing, because with a teaching background and also with a social work background, I think, well, I guess my makeup is that I get a great deal of satisfaction of working with people and dealing with people and talking with people, and I guess I knew inside of me that's what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Over the years, Bob, I wonder if I don't know whether you've given any thought to this kind of idea or not, but has it meant something special to you to be a social worker, to be a professional social worker?
yes, I think it has. I think I could have done some of the things without professional training, but I wouldn't have done them as meaningful and as well-intentioned without the professional background that I got. I think my professional background really added to what I felt I could do for other people.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I, even today, I advise young people who have an inclination for that to go into social work training and to take that training, and maybe even branch out from that if they feel they want to, but with that sort of solid background training in dealing with people, I think it helps everybody out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder if in closing, Bob, there's anything you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I think it's been a wonderful, I was going to say, 35 years or so that I've been in social work training. And the thing that I would urge young social workers starting out just now in the profession and in the schools is to look forward and to try every type of experience they can in social work and determine where their strengths lie and really what they want to do as an accomplishment. And I think that once having made the decision and taken the training, they'll never regret it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, I'd like to thank you very much for spending time with us this morning.
I've enjoyed it very much.
Good.
Yeah.
I have too.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it, and I've felt quite relaxed, and I hope you have.
Very much so. Thank you. Yeah, well, Bob, one of the things that maybe we'll close too early.
Yes.
Yeah, and you were going to tell us about some of the volunteer work that you've been involved in.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting for other workers to realize that since retirement, I have done quite a bit of volunteer work. In Manitoba, I volunteered to work with the United Appeal and headed up a group of family agencies and became the family agency representative for the United Appeal, and had to deal with budgeting and helping these agencies make the proper use of the money that the United Appeal provided. And also on my own, I volunteered to visit weekly to a nursing home where the people were mostly bedridden and had no one to visit them. And this was in Winnipeg, and would go every week and be assigned certain people that the matron thought I should visit. And this was on a weekly basis, and it really was an eye-opener for me because as you get older, you wonder what's going to happen to you.
Mm-hmm.
And here were these people really just begging really for having someone to talk to. And of course I went in every week and spent the day doing this. And since coming to Victoria, I've volunteered with the James Bay Community Project. And I'm doing some counseling on referrals from 2 of the doctors and doing some volunteer work in the library.
Mm-hmm.
And I think all social workers, when they come to the retirement age, will never stop working. So as volunteers, I think they can go right ahead because there's all sorts of opportunities. And maybe when things get tight, as they are now in the welfare programs, that volunteers will be doing more and more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with the skills and experience that you've had and the volunteer opportunities that are around, I'm sure that you've really made a valuable contribution
Well, we hope so, and
in both ways.
still going on while I'm able.
Great. Okay.
Fine.
Thanks again, Bob.
Yeah. You'll get something out of that. You won't need
Oh,
to.
yes. Yes, indeed.